There are important people headed here right now. The word is getting out. This is the site that's going to change everything. No wonder this has been a hidden site, guys.
You've shone a light on a number of very important sites, the study of which is going to change our understanding of the planet's history, humanity's history, who we are, and where we might be going.
We're at a point where it's a massive paradigm shift that's about to occur in our reality. This information has been known by many powerful people, elites, those who are in charge of this narrative for a very, very long time. We don't know how long. Could be hundreds of years, could be thousands of years. This has been carried down with this knowing, but there was obviously a decision made to hide this information that I believe is traced back to the emergence of the Holy Roman Empire, where it was an attempt to control history and the narrative in a way that it's never been before. And that has continued on to where we are now.
In 2017, divers in Lake Van in East Turkey discovered some megalithic remains. What they found has thrown a spanner into the works of conventional archaeological timelines. On the other hand, the find in Lake Van may provide a missing link in our history of ancient civilizations and even our understanding of human origins. Here to unpack this fascinating topic is award-winning researcher and author Matthew LaCroix. Matt, welcome back to the Fifth Kind TV.
Thanks, Paul. I love being here with you. It's always one of my favorite mind melt situations where you and I get to talk about the ancients and anything that connects to this incredible story that we're part of. So it's an honor to be sitting down to talk to you to hopefully change history today.
Likewise. It's always a pleasure to have you with us. Now, anyone with a knowledge of the biblical story of Noah, or who knows about the megalithic site at Göbekli Tepe, or the find of the first farm at Karagada, their ears will prick up as soon as we mention southeast Turkey, which is where Lake Van is. Now, today, I really don't want to interrupt you with too many questions. I just want you to share your research from that part of the world. And perhaps I can just ask you to begin by telling us what first drew your attention to that part of the world and this find in particular.
Yeah, this is I can't tell you other than the best thing I can describe it as is it's a very exciting thing right now. I feel very excited. I wish I could be there in Eastern Turkey right now. And that is in the works. Hopefully that is going to happen. But I just want to say for everyone listening to this, if no one's ever heard of me or seen any of this work, what I want to do today is unveil a set of new theories and new archaeological discoveries, as Paul mentioned, that I believe will link so many pieces of this mystery story that we have, these lost chapters that have occurred not only in the last 6,000 years, but before the Younger Dryas, before the Older Dryas, and before the Oldest Dryas. Not a term that is used very often, but as we get back into ancient times before the last ice age, we see emerging evidence of highly sophisticated, incredibly knowledgeable and wise civilizations that emerged out of some certain parts of the world and built these incredible structures. But what remained unknown was where it originated from and how the whole story connected. When we look at something like Atlantis, or even as we'll emerge and talk more later about like the ancient Athenians, we find that there is a thread of a story here connecting to a set of incredibly sophisticated civilizations that seem to have rose up in ancient history that largely became a myth today. Now, what we're going to do today is we're not only going to link ancient Atlantis, ancient Kem in Egypt, the pre-dynastic period that built the Great Pyramids of Giza and, the Great Sphinx. But we're going to link ancient Sumer, we're going to link Peru, we're going to link Bolivia, we're going to link basically this lost chapter of civilizations around the world. And we're going to expand on something that has been what I would consider someone who studies ancient Sumer, ancient Akkadian, Babylonian, ancient Hittites throughout like the Mediterranean region, such as places like Baalbek, Lebanon. That region is such a mysterious area with such an ancient history that seems to go back so much further than we've been told. And not only that, but what we're going to talk about today is there seems to be this missing link that's becoming known through bits and pieces of evidence that are emerging, like Paul had mentioned, in places like Eastern Turkey, as well as other areas like Syria and throughout Iraq and other parts of the world. So Paul, today, this is a body of work that has basically come out of years and years and years of studying specifically Mesopotamia, as well as the megaliths in other parts of the world like China and Peru, like I mentioned, but specifically Mesopotamia, to try to understand how the ancient Sumerian kings and this story of the Anuna through the thousands of cuneiform tablets, how that story fits into both biblical, both ancient spiritual and religious text, like the Book of Enoch and like the Gnostic texts, like the Nag Hammadi scriptures, how the whole thing fits together. And I believe that Eastern Turkey with Lake Van is that missing link that can basically change our entire understanding, hopefully forever.
It's certainly a very important node, Southeast Turkey, in the story of humanity, and eyes have been on it for a long time. The Fertile Crescent has long been recognized as the cradle of civilization. Was there some background to these divers diving in Lake Van? Did they know what they were looking for? Were they expecting to find something?
Yeah, so that's a thread on a whole story that we're going to begin. But what I'll start by saying before we get into that discovery and how it links, because we have to actually start in Sumer. But I want to add that because it's an exciting area, and I want people to understand the discoveries that are coming out of Eastern Turkey. And this is actually not that close to Göbekli Tepe. I believe Göbekli Tepe was a Western iteration of the migration of these civilizations that built that as an astronomical library. But the level of sophistication and what we're talking about, in my opinion, far exceeds what we find at Göbekli Tepe. Now, that doesn't downgrade the significance of Göbekli Tepe in any means. I mean, the T-shaped pillars are multi-ton T-shaped pillars, and we're aligned to celestial connections that are absolutely incredible. But what we find at Lake Van are things like ancient kings list and these rock reliefs that connect to Sumer, the same gods shared. We find giant megaliths of of precision that is honestly some of the finest in the world and is largely unknown. Now, so to answer your question, what makes this so exciting is that these discoveries in Eastern Turkey are only 5 to 10 years old in most cases. Now, if you look at places like Göbekli Tepe, that was largely discovered around World War II. So, and that's sort of a new kid in the block still in terms of them uncovering it and understanding it. So what we're talking about is so new that most, even people in our academic community that study this, have never even heard of these sites. And what I want to say is, in 2017, when these divers were diving in Lake Van, they were not looking for archaeological ruins. I want that to be extremely well known and understood. Lake Van is one of the most ancient lakes on Earth. It has sediments on the bottom that are so deep, they actually can take cores like an ice core in a similar way and be able to understand Earth history. And so they've been studying Lake Van for a while in that sense. It has almost like an incredibly alien-like world, by the way, at the bottom of the lake, because it's in a super, super saline lake and has no inlet or outlet. It has this very strange evaporational cooling and different effects where it creates these saltwater structures that look like something out of like a fairy tale or some kind of a whimsical movie that someone made up in their head. So when they were diving down to look at these structures, these saltwater structures that form on the bottom, they accidentally found, because it's a huge lake. They were diving all over the place, but they accidentally at one point in 2017, when they were in the northwest corner underneath a mountain called Sufan Dagi, a place called Kef Kalesi, they discovered the remnants of an entire civilization that they think is the Urartu civilization. On hundreds of feet down below the lake they found these megalithic blocks in stone, and I have all those images coming up in a second, guys. So it's not like one of those things I'm just going to mention and then you don't see anything. We're going to present all of that as we go forward. That was sort of like a little bit of a summary to get us into this. So Paul, I just want to say before we go forward that I honestly have so much respect for your work, your connections to both ancient Sumer in that area of Mesopotamia, as well as the biblical connections. this could not be a better fit for this conversation. So I'm excited to talk to you about this today, and please interject at any point, because if anyone will see some of these connections and how significant they are, it's going to be you.
Well, I love joining these dots to get the fuller picture, and you've whet my appetite to hear what the connections were between what we know about the cultures that were birthed by ancient Sumer and what's been found in Lake Van. So let me unleash you. We'll go there.
I truly appreciate everyone that is in this field, no matter who you are, in this field of trying to change history. And I just want to come out by saying that I want to work with any researcher that wants to seriously work on this, because at the end of the day, it's not about competing. It's about coming together to change this entire narrative that not only has us look at our history in a way that's completely different than we ever have, but it changes the very foundation of how we view our existence in this reality and in the universe. It empowers us in a way where, when we understand these ancient connections that we're about to go over, it makes us view everything in a way that you open your eyes almost like it's the first time. It's like viewing reality and you're saying, I am truly a god of this reality. I have the potential to change everything if I realize the ancient connections and the understanding that we once had. And these are those connections that can do that. So let's start, Paul, by sharing the presentation, and we can get started, okay?
For sure.
So for those who don't know my work, or for those who know my work, they know that I'm extremely passionate about this region of the world. Asia Minor, the Fertile Crescent, ancient Mesopotamia, down through the Egyptian area, the Arabian Peninsula, as well as many others. But it's an incredibly mysterious and ancient land. And the first thing I want to say right out of the gate is that evidence is pointing towards a completely different story than obviously we've been taught in school about this region. Now, I do think there were many firsts that occurred here. Civilization emerging, creating the first cities, the first ancient connection we're going to find with the Anuna, as we'll get talking about as we go along here. There are a lot of firsts here, but it doesn't mean that the first time occurred 6,000 years ago. And I guess that's probably the most important point to emphasize here, is that I want to completely throw out the book of history. Okay, let's just take it and let's have a book burning party, and let's start over and rewrite it again, right? Let's take all the greatest minds in history, right? Let's take Randall Carlson, let's take Graham Hancock, let's take you, Paul, let's take Billy Carson, let's take Ben from Uncharted X, let's take countless others, and let's all come together and let's rewrite this history book, right? Let's make it be something that's based on the evidence and based on an unbiased understanding of history. So let's start now, at this moment. Now, what to start at that moment, the first thing we have to discuss is that this is an ancient and mysterious region that seems to go back far longer than 6,000 years, far longer than 12,000 years with the Younger Dryas, potentially far longer than even 20,000 years. The region that we know of as that's today Iraq and Syria up through Turkey seems to have these epics of civilizations rising and falling. Now, the rising seems to come at 2 points, and then the falling seems to lead up to our current time, meaning that there was so much knowledge and so much handed down earlier on that as these disasters we're about to talk about and these iterations of civilizations rose up and came and went, they became less sophisticated and had less and less knowledge over time, not more. And that's obviously a very important point to make, because we show structures all around the world that show high sophistication on their lowermost levels, with almost precision beyond some of our capabilities today, using granite, basalt, and some other stones that are so sharp, even in places like Pumapunku in Bolivia, you can cut your finger on some of the andesite blocks that are still there now. It's unbelievable, because those blocks are likely over 20,000 years old, and we have a lot of evidence to prove that. And it connects to an understanding that these civilizations we're about to talk about, and I want to say these because I believe it was largely two civilizations over two epic time periods that we're going to be talking about. They built all the greatest structures on Earth, the great pyramids, the highly sophisticated megaliths that are precisely carved to magnetic north and aligned to the cardinal points, all these things. But I want to emphasize that I'm not talking about structures like Stonehenge. I'm not talking about structures throughout France and some of these domes and these others. That doesn't mean that those people weren't smart and had incredible knowledge. It just, what I'm going to emphasize and refer to in regards to them is that they're from another time period of history that I'm not referring, that's not part of what I'm talking about today. Okay. And that's why their megaliths are so crude looking in comparison to the others that we're going to discuss. They were trying to almost mimic their ancestors, but they didn't have the tools or the means to be able to do anything like they did. So in these ancient stories, in Eridu, the first city ever created, this patron city to Enki, this Sumerian god, we find that the first man, this perfected man, came out of that. We find it through a tablet called the Myth of Adapa. And Adapa was the first name, and it's Adamu, Adapa. It's like the same, it's this reference back to this perfect being like Eden, like in the Eden story, basically, right? In Adam. And what we find is that Eridu is one of 5 cities created here before a set of catastrophes came through and wiped everything out, okay? And in these cities, we find that the kings that were there were ruling for potentially hundreds, if not thousands of years, and seemed to have some kind of a bloodline and a connection that is different than we have today. They were a different kind of people. They seem to have a connection in ways that we don't understand today, and we're trying to re-understand, I should say. And the stories, as I started to go forward in this, I started to try to understand it from the lens of, well, where are these cities located? Are they real places? Is everything that happened there real? Can I separate allegory from these stories? Can I separate some of these other motifs and some of these other things that are not actually, that are symbolic and not literal? But what about the literal components to them? And where does that story lead? And that is where the excitement of this path goes to, that we're going to go down today. Now, according to the tablets, the first 5 cities ever created were destroyed. The last of those cities was known as Shuruppak, and we found those cities today, and we know they exist, and I'm going to show you pictures in a second. But in those stories, we find that the last king of that city was essentially warned to basically have to rebuild humanity, and that's the biblical figure that became Noah. Now that is where we're going to go with this whole story, because up until about 8 months ago or so, I was stuck on where the Atrahasis goes with everything. But we're going to progress forward with it and actually take it through and understand how it connects to all the ancient megaliths, Atlantis, the ancient Athenians, Egypt, all around the world. Now, on the left side of the screen is the Atrahasis, my favorite set of tablets. To me, it encompasses our story in the greatest possible way. My second favorite set of tablets is the Epic of Gilgamesh that's shown on the right. Now, the combination of these 2 tablets could literally tell us the majority of what we need to understand, in my opinion, for trying to recreate ancient history. Now, that's interesting because they were actually written at completely different time periods. The tablet on the right, Epic of Gilgamesh, is written through a much later iteration of basically that Sumerian Akkadian region with an ancient king known as Gilgamesh, who was ruling over the city of Uruk. However, he carries down the same stories as before, and that's why it's important and relevant. Now, in these stories, we find out that Eridu was the first city ever created. Now, we were told that was a myth previously, Paul, right? And we know, if anyone's followed my work, they know that I've tried to do a whole campaign to save Eridu because it's basically one of the saddest stories of any archaeological site in the world. It's a site that was found and discovered in the late 1800s and was excavated up through 1946 and 1948 by Oxford University and the university out of Baghdad, Iraq. And they found numerous tablets. They found this previous, what was considered a mythical city that wasn't supposed to be real, the first city ever created, and they find it. And It's no longer a myth any longer. And then at some point between 1946 and 1948, they abandoned the entire site after excavating only a tiny fraction of the lower part of the city, and they never even excavated the ziggurat, which is what is the photo I'm showing you right now. Is that Urartu is famous because it had this massive ziggurat, which is, by the way, it's like often a four-sided pyramid, which we're going to talk about as we go along, which is symbolic. But the ziggurat at Urartu was supposed to be one of the most incredible ziggurats in all of the ancient world. And it was the oldest and first ziggurat ever built. And it was known as the ziggurat of Urartu, or the ziggurat of the Abzu. And it was a temple dedicated to the underworld because Enki was a god of the underworld. And we'll talk about what that means as we go along here. But Urartu has connotations of religious connotations, and many, many others, of basically being a disruptive site that could completely change our understanding of history. I have showed numerous photos of this site with people looting it on a wide scale level. There is no infrastructure at all. There's nothing being done at this site. It is basically being stolen from the world. Ancient tablets are the most important in the world. And there are seashells covering the top of this giant temple site mountain that basically prove that it was part of a great catastrophe flood, just like it's described. So I say that as an introduction to this because it was proven to be real, and it's being hidden and deliberately pushed out of history because it doesn't fit with the narrative, because it's supposed to be potentially well over 20,000 years old, according to the tablets. Now, this is where the next part of this goes that is so important to all this work. The last of those cities that, again, was considered another myth was with Shuruppak. Now, Shuruppak was found in 1931, and these are actual photos of Shuruppak. The first thing I want to point out, which is the name of Shuruppak today, is called Farah. But back then it is called Shuruppak, and I have a map on the left to show you where it is in relation. Look at its relation to basically the ancient world between Bad Tabira, Shuruppak, Urartu, and up through this ancient region. There's Kish above it, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Mm-hmm. But here, another myth that became a reality, Paul. Another place that was supposed to not be real. They dig down. In some cases, they had to go 40 to 50 feet down through sediment to find this site. Okay? That is an incredible amount of soil and debris to have to go down to uncover the ruins of this ancient city. And here's a photo of it, like just so people can try to envision and imagine this. They had to create these terraces to basically walk down to get into the site. And one of the things that was absolutely fascinating if you study Shuruppak, look at the excavations of Farah from 1931. You'll find papers that were done, academic papers on the site, because there were a couple researchers that were fascinated by this. They were biblical researchers as well as archaeological researchers that read about the significance of the site and how it was supposedly destroyed in a great flood. And they wanted to understand if any of it was true, because again, the academic world considers the flood here to be a localized event. If you learn about it in school, they consider it to be a localized event with the flooding of the Euphrates and Tigris as part of like a spring flood. Which, by the way, I'm not going to sit here and talk to you and not admit that I know that the Euphrates and Tigris is prone to flooding. Completely understandable, but not at the scale of what we're talking about here. That's what ties into this researcher. He came in, and the understanding was that these sites were something like maybe 1600 BC or something. He came in, and he studied the layers because he wasn't actually doing the full excavations. He was working at the site. What he was doing was specifically studying the layers, not the actual site. Other archaeologists were studying the ruins that were coming out of the actual site. He was studying the layers. And what he was studying was he was looking for evidence of a catastrophic flood and whether or not there were intermittent periods of civilization living there that basically would prove that the flood isn't that ancient. So, to tell you what that means. If you were going down through the layers and you found evidence of subsequent cultures that have lived there throughout those layers, it would mean that the layers were not deposited from a flood. They were deposited probably naturally from over time, right? Because they'd be living in those layers and you'd find evidence of it. But what he found absolutely astonished him. In the 45 to 50 feet of excavating Shuruppak, he found not one remain, not one. And I want to like put that in bold. He even like, it stated that he was baffled by it in the article, that he didn't find one piece of human remains or evidence of civilization anywhere in the layers between 45 to 50 feet at all. And he wrote about how he couldn't understand how that could be impossible unless the flood was a lot older than academics had admitted. And he had to say that in the article. And it was like, and he basically was refuted out of the academic community after that. And you never heard from him ever again. And like, most people have never heard of that study that was done. And I have that all printed out and I have it saved for that very purpose. But basically what came out of that was, look, the stories of this great catastrophe of a wall of water basically wiping out the ancient world in a way where it caused them to have to rebuild over again. And in this case of Eridu and of most of Eridu, we'll call it some parts of Eridu, but especially Shuruppak, of any of these ancient sites, it was so destroyed, the catastrophes were so extreme here that it piled that 50 feet of wall of mud on it and remained there for well over, I want to say well over, because I don't believe this is from the Younger Dryas, and we'll get into that, well over 12,000 years this has sat here and remained waiting for history to retell this story, Paul. And I think it's time to retell that story, don't you?
Absolutely. It's so fundamentally challenging because what we're currently learning would suggest that civilization begins after the Younger Dryas. I mean, that first farm identified at Kragadar, that's just 10,000 years old. That's on sort of this end of the cusp of the Younger Dryas. So suddenly to find that we're talking about ancient cities pre-existing the Younger Dryas suddenly tells us that we know next to nothing about where we've all come from. So it's a profound discovery.
It absolutely is. I mean, the way I see it, and I haven't even gotten into the profound, exciting parts, and I apologize if I'm going a little bit too slow for people, but I want this to be a full presentation that doesn't miss anything. That's what I want this to essentially be part of. And the first thing to mention, to add on to the time periods of this, right? Let's for a minute remember, yes, the Sumerian king list and all the reigns added up. Yes, we get like 200,000 years. But let's pause on that for a second, because I know many think those are symbolic numbers. Let's pause for a second on that, and let's go a different direction until we move. I don't want to move forward on these slides to get a time frame, until we establish an understanding first. The first thing is that when we're reestablishing understanding of the ancient world, one of the things that came up in studies, looking at geodesy, I mentioned the 30th parallel, guys, right? Being found on the 30th parallel, which is basically this equidistance between the equator and the northern hemisphere. That area was incredibly important energetically for the ancients, as well as some others relating to ley lines and other things. But one of the things that was interesting was the cosmological connection to different constellations based on the precession of the equinox. This axial tilt of the Earth and forces it to face different constellations every 2,100 years, which forms the great year of 26,000 years, roughly. And what that tells us is that the ancients built all their structures to map that. One of the fascinating things about that, though, is that when you're looking at Eridu, specifically Eridu and parts of the old part of Babylon, as well as Shuruppak, and I think that it's also the study was done on parts of Bad Tabira. They found that some of the structures that were part of the temples in each place, they found that they precisely aligned to magnetic north everywhere on the Earth, but not any longer. Not any longer. And you're going to see that type of reference echoed with the pyramids in a second that we're going to talk about in the Great Sphinx. what they found was that when they used geodesy with the understanding that the ancients aligned to everything perfect, the cardinal points, magnetic north, the cosmos, everything, they found out that when you try to align those two star constellations and magnetic north, there's issues with trying to align recently in history. And I mean even Younger Dryas recent. They found that in some of the studies, they had to go back over 100,000 years to align structures like Eridu. Now, to Eridu today on a satellite map, until they blurred it, and if anybody has listened to the Julian Dory podcast might chuckle at that comment, but they absolutely did blur the imagery over Eridu within several months. I noticed several. I think it was 6 months ago or more. I noticed that the imagery was blurred over Eridu. Anyway. Go look at it today. You can still see the alignments. But if you take the alignments of the city, you'll see basically a geometric design of the city. Okay, if you try to align that with when it aligned to those the constellations and with magnetic true north, what you're going to get to that time period is that it's something like over 100,000 years ago. Now I want to add another layer to that because remember we're rewriting history again. I'm going to add another layer to that. In Egypt, when we're studying, I just had an awesome conversation the other day, just a couple weeks ago with Robert Schock. Awesome conversation, sitting down to talk about the weathering of the Sphinx enclosure, and it was one of those talks where I'm like, Robert, listen, do you think there's evidence of this being a tsunami weathering or more of a rainfall weathering? And Robert believed it was rainfall weathering. And we had this whole debate conversation for it that hopefully we can do again in the future. If Robert's listening, I would love to do that again, Robert. But one of the things that's fascinating about that was, well, wait a minute, though. If John Anthony West brought up an incredibly mind-blowing concept to think about for a second. Let's, for a moment, not think that the Sphinx and the Great Pyramids were built during the Younger Dryas period to align to Leo, during like the 12,800 period, roughly, right? Let's for a minute take that out of the example because that time period of Earth was actually quite volatile. Many don't know that the Younger Dryas is only one part of a great catastrophic cycle that is also aligned what's called the Older Dryas. And the Older Dryas is when we got the first set of disasters on the planet as part of that time period, which was roughly 1,500 years long. Just try to wrap your head around that for a second. And try to think about cities like Derinkuyu and others. Some of these catastrophes happened during intervals that occurred over a period of interglacial, okay, between the Holocene and the last ice age. That's basically was a 1,500-year period. Now, during the Younger Dryas period, it was a catastrophic time period in history around the world. There was a lot of massive tsunamis, enormous rainfall, droughts some places, wildfires, volcanoes. The world was in a catastrophe. It doesn't make sense, in my opinion, personally. And this is what's shared by John Anthony West in The Serpent in the Sky. Brilliant man. Rest in peace, my good friend. He proposed that no, not 12,000 years ago, not 20,000 years ago, not 30,000 years ago, but when did the Great Sphinx last align to Leo during a time period that wasn't catastrophic on the Earth? He came to an age of 38,000 years ago. Okay? Coincidentally, if you add up the Turin King list, the Egyptian papyrus list, basically the list that came out of the kings of Egypt, you can add up and get the reigns add up to roughly 38,000 years. Okay? What we're finding here is that, look, it seems likely that the Great Pyramids of Egypt and the Sphinx looks like it was actually built 38,000 years ago. Okay? Now, why is that important? Because it gives us a time frame, a benchmark to go from. The Eridu alignments to magnetic north and these other constellations gives us an age over 100. So we now can start to put things in different places. That would mean that this city right here in front of you, Shuruppak, this 50 feet, has been sitting there potentially for, if this is right, it would be sitting there for potentially over 100,000, at least 50,000 years, if not 100, under this buried and lost to time nearly, right? Now, that's going to be fascinating to people because as we get into things like the dating of Atlantis and trying to do all of this, it's going to start putting together a lost timeline that shows us that our story goes back many, many iterations, okay? Many iterations. Now, I want to bring up a quote really, really quick before I move forward to point this out. The story of Atlantis comes from, and I want to give a brief synopsis of this. The story of Atlantis actually doesn't really come from Plato as the primary source. Plato actually was someone who recorded it down from Socrates, who had discussed it and had carried it down from Solon. So it's a hearsay story that came down through Plato in the Timaeus and Critias. But the real source, if we want to get back to it, comes from Socrates, Solon, Diodorus, and the temple priests of Sais out of Egypt. And that is where our new understanding, and I've been working with releasing with Billy Carson, the Epic of Humanity, is going to have more evidence that is the most evidence that's ever proved Atlantis exists and the rival civilization known as the ancient Athenians, which is going to lead into all of this work that we're talking about. Now, in those stories, the way you find out that Atlantis ever existed is because Solon was a Greek poet who traveled down to Egypt and was the first person from like the outside world during that time period to go into ancient Egypt. And he met this set of temple priests outside of Heliopolis at a temple called the Temple of Sais, S-A-I-S. There are artist renderings of that temple you can still see today. Now, in that temple, for those who still think that this whole thing is a myth, in that temple, there was an ancient priest known as Sonchis, S-O-N-C-H-I-S, for people who want to look it up. This is a very real story. Like we're taking myth and we're making it a reality. Sonchis was the great elder priest of the ancient Egyptians. He was basically the smartest dude that was left alive in the world. That's what our understanding was of this man. Imagine a man who was tasked with preserving the entire ancient story of mankind. The priest known as Sonchis was that man. He was one of the greatest men in history that nobody's ever heard of. So I want his memory to be preserved, because Sonchis is the only reason why we know Atlantis ever existed. Solon meets with Sonchis, who sits him down and tells him that in the temple lies the entire story of Atlantis, carved into the walls, as well as many other civilizations, he says. Many other. He says Atlantis was only one iteration of the civilizations that have been here. He states that, he says, "Oh, Solon, you Greeks remember only one deluge," right? Because there was an ancient deluge in Greek history too, which is true. He says, "But there have been many, primarily of water and fire." And so what we find is that he goes on to tell him that there was a grand civilization known as Atlantis, and he tells us where it was, and it stretched from the Atlantic through Western Africa down through the Maya area of Mexico and Cuba. And this story is going to go there as well. But that whole story, he tries to emphasize over and over again that it's a lot older than we know, and that it's far before even the Greeks, and that's where we start to get into like, well, okay, so is that 50,000 years ago, like Edgar Cayce states, like Helena Blavatsky states with The Secret Doctrine, which I highly recommend people read if they haven't read it. I'm starting to believe more and more that these dates were starting to corral them into a time period. All right, so now let's move forward. That was a long-winded way to describe a very giant background, but it has to be to do it justice, guys, okay? So going forward, what you see on your screen is called Mount Ararat. This is one of the most sacred mountains on Earth. Now, in this story, Shuruppak, what you find is that Shuruppak was the last of the 5 original pre-Diluvian, meaning pre-flood cities that were ever created on Earth by the great Anuna. They state that it was ruled by a set of kings that were directly connected to their bloodline. Okay, remember they lived these long reigns. And according to the story, the Atrahasis specifically, you find that there was a son of a great king. The king was known as Urartu, and he ruled Shuruppak for hundreds of years. And at some point, he handed down the kingship at the very end of his reign to his son, who is known as Utnapishtim, or Isaiah Sudra, depending on the text. He would become the biblical figure of Noah. Now, for the purposes of ease, even though I've gone back and forth in other shows, I want to refer to this character as Noah, because it's too confusing for people to use different names. But to set the record straight, his ancient name in the Sumerian king list, his name was Utnapishtim. and he was this last of the great line of Sumerian kings. Okay? His name later in the Epic of Gilgamesh is Ziusudra, but what became the Christian name became the name Noah. So from this point on, we'll refer to him just as that. Okay? Now, Noah was warned secretly of a coming catastrophe that was supposedly, according to the tablets, the gods created to wipe out the old world. They said it was too loud. Perhaps that referred to language and a lack of our understanding balance, perhaps. But Enlil was furious and wanted to wipe out humanity, according to the Atrahasis. So he creates a set of disasters to basically destroy the old world. And they essentially want to start over again. Well, Enki is brought into this council, the Council of 12, according to the Atrahasis, and he is told that he cannot tell and warn any of humanity. Well, he breaks his pact in a clever way by speaking through a reed bed to Noah, who he tells him is his son, is an ancient bloodline descendant of him, and that he tells him it is absolutely critical that his bloodline is preserved into the future for humanity, and that a coming catastrophe is coming, and that he must survive, and in order to survive, he has to build a certain kind of craft, a craft that can withstand the end of the world, and that his three sons are basically going to be the descendants of the new world. Now, Paul, that is where my research has been stuck for all of this time, and I want to get your thoughts on that briefly before I move forward.
On what aspect of it specifically?
Would you say that there's been confusion and a lack of understanding how we can connect this ancient story of Sumer with Atlantis, with Peru, and around the world? It's previously been something that there's been a very little information to connect that.
Yes, I mean, it's a correlation that gets people's attention, a correlation of flood narratives, but it's far more complex than I think people usually acknowledge. So in the Christian world, often scholars will say, here we've got our narrative of a flood, and we find external corroborations of that memory, except that even within the Bible, it's more complex. There are at least 3 flood narratives and perhaps 2 flood events in the pages of Genesis. By the time you get to Genesis 11, 5 planetary resets. So it's clearly far more complex. Why are these multiple reset stories? And how does that relate to the conclusion of the life of 5 ancient cities and 5 ancient kings receiving 5 warnings? In the Bible, of course, it's all contracted into a single story of God changing his mind about this, that, and the other. In the Sumerian, it's not that. We've got factions disagreeing over the progress of human society. And yet, the motif that always repeats is of an escape capsule and of a family and a number of bloodlines represented there. So if you just take the Noah story at face value, it's 5 bloodlines that survived the catastrophe. If you approach the story through DNA research, we find that our most recent shared male ancestor is far more recent than our most recent shared female ancestor, which again suggests this bottleneck. So I think melding traditions from around the world about catastrophes and floods is very, very complex, and far more complex than we've acknowledged hitherto.
Paul, that's beautifully said. Thank you. That's exactly, I wanted to get your take on that, to show and reiterate the fact that this has been talked about in these texts throughout history, all around the world. It is a thread that carries throughout time, throughout our ancestors that have carried down to us to understand our past. And my hope is that we can rebuild and try to link those missing pieces. Because like you said, this Noah figure at the end of the Atrahasis, he's warned to build this craft with bitumen, basically this tar-like material to survive the end of the world. But unfortunately, the tablets end on this location that you're seeing on the screen, on Mount Ararat. And let's continue from there. In the Atrahasis, Noah and his 3 sons, his wife, and some of the select animals they are supposedly brought, not two of every kind. The story was changed later on. But they do land on Mount Ararat because it is one of the largest mountains in all of Asia Minor and in all of Asia. Outside of the Caucasus region of the Georgia region, of that part of the Black Sea, it's the largest region the largest mountain outside of the Himalayas. It is absolutely massive. And so I want to point out that this would have all the characteristics needed for, as receding waters from a set of tsunamis, let's say, were receding, this would be a place that would fit the narrative of what would actually happen if it's described, right? And so in that story, he lands on the mountain, and Enlil comes down, descends down, and is furious. States that no man is ever supposed to survive the flood. And then Enki states that he warned him because it's his ancestral bloodline. And that's what we find out. And basically the tablet essentially ends. It's broken off, and we never find out anything else again. Now, if that's deliberate or not, who knows? Meanwhile, there's a set of tablets called the Legend of Etana that states that after the great flood and catastrophe, Etana is this bloodline king that ends up creating a city that in the new world known as Kish. Paul is right. Exactly right. There were several different bloodline ancestral members of these Sumerian kings that seemed to were creating a new world after these set of catastrophes went through. And Kish was one of them. And I've talked about it in the past. But I sort of I had a dead end at Kish because I couldn't figure out how to Kish connected anywhere else in the world until this research in Eastern Turkey basically opened up this entire story in a way that it's never been opened up before. Okay? Because I was stuck at the end of the Atrahasis not knowing where the sons of Noah went. Because was the biblical story true? Did they really go off in those parts of the world? There wasn't any archaeological proof that I could find or any kind of ancient libraries that supported that at the time. And so I was stuck until about 8 or 9 months ago when everything changed. I became aware of a site called Zernaki Tepe in northern part of Lake Van in eastern Turkey. And so just to point out, Lake Van is an ancient lake that's 1,500 feet deep. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, it is a very mysterious and ancient land. I have talked to a number of native Armenians who are incredibly proud of the region, and they should be. And they talk all about how King Haik is like the greatest hero of their region that created the ancient Armenian region long before this was Turkey, and that this was an ancient land that the Urartu, it's called the Urartu civilization, was part of. Now take the word Urartu, Urartu, and you break it down, you get the city of Ur. It is directly related as an offshoot to the civilizations of Sumer, and we're going to see more connections as we go forth here. The first thing that got my attention, though, was Zernaki Tepe, because what I came across basically online was photos from the University of Istanbul, Ankara University, and Van University of excavations that started in 2014. And there basically we're looking through and finding and seeing these giant megaliths and ancient kings lists that shouldn't be there. And as I went along, I started to find other cities along the way that were proving the foundations of what I believe is a previously unknown civilization called the Ararat Civilization or the Lake Van Civilization, basically the beginnings of the Armenian civilization. And that predated long before the Urartu civilization was here. And that is the civilization that archaeologists credit any kind of an archaeological ruin that's ancient to. That's an important point to make because further west in Turkey, in places like San Simeon and in Hattusa, Turkey, that is credited as being a site dedicated to the Hittite civilization, whereas the Hittites was just another later iteration of a civilization that found that site and then built on top of it. So here in Lake Van, the first thing to mention is The evidence is strongly suggesting that these ruins are not related at all to the Urartu civilization in any means. And it is much like we find around the world. The Urartu civilization was a later iteration of these, like we find in Sumer, like the Akkadians or the Babylonians, that came to this region, knew the history, and tried to build on top and try to rebuild the old world like they knew. But they lacked this technological sophistication, the tools, the understanding. And so that's why we've lost more and more over time and not gained more. Now, I'm going to show you these as we go along, but as we go, you'll see I stumbled along sites like Kavis Tepe and Kef Kalesi. And in Kef Kalesi is a site that almost nobody is talking about. It's like unknown to the world. And I want to share the importance of this and why this is so exciting as we go here. Okay, so Paul, the first site and the first thing to bring up and show here is that this box relief, this gigantic basalt or granite box, came from this site below Kef Kalesi. The city right there is called Adel Seves. But it's basically just a small town, and they stumbled upon the ruins of an ancient civilization. And as we were talking about earlier in the show, Paul, when divers subsequently during that same time period were diving off of the lake, that's the reason they essentially went and dove off of that city, was that they found this giant rock relief box that I'm about to show you in a second. And Kef Kalesi is a phenomenal site that we're going to get into and show you more pictures in a second. But it was a site that I had never heard of and I'd never seen in any papers, and is not being excavated. And it was something that I found by searching through terrain in Google Earth and through various images of his universities that are visiting and traveling around. But because those ruins, they thought it was the Urartu civilization, it's almost been ignored. And that's what is so incredible about this, is that it's coming to light now. And that's what I want people to reiterate. So if you've looked at Sumer, ancient Sumer, and I don't have a comparison to show on the screen, like for instance, the Ashurbanipal Library, the Tree of Life mural, you're going to see comparisons to this that are uncanny and almost astounding. Basically what we find are the depictions and symbology that are shown in this is so similar that it's like an exact reiteration of Sumer. It's like they were trying to recreate another civilization like Sumer. And what you find is the depictions of this god that are shown here. This god is called God Haldi or Kaldi, depending on the pronunciation. Now, he has the characteristics of this god of these civilization here that I'm calling the Ararat Civilization. He has the exact same characteristics, exactly mimicking Enlil in Sumer. And I mean the same exact thunderstorm god, basically a god of power and strength. And that's why we see the symbol of the lion here. And we see the wings with the passing of the pine cone. And you can see a little bowl in his hand. That's probably the same thing as like the handbag like symbol, which is like passing of knowledge for ultimate knowledge of everything. And that's what this essentially is showing. Now, look in the center there, you see what is, I believe, either fig or a cypress tree. Somebody please correct me if I'm wrong, but that's just a tree that's from that region. And it's just like we find in the Tree of Life mural, but it was either a willow or another similar tree from their region they had. And it's just a different way of showing the Tree of Life in both depictions. Now at the top, you see the balance, the hemisphere, right? The balance of the left and right brain. You see this figure that's like a phoenix griffin eagle. Basically, this is showing you the path of enlightenment. And I want you, Paul, just to stare at this for a second, and I'm going to make an incredibly bold statement right now. I've been staring at this box, and I've laughed because it's funny to me. I've been staring at this box for 6 months. I can't tell you how many nights I've been kept up in the middle of the night, 2-3 o'clock in the morning, thinking about this box, this rock relief right here. I have come to the conclusion, after studying the symbology in this, that this may be one of the most significant ancient rock reliefs, carvings of anywhere in the world. I put this on the level of like the Tree of Life from the Ashurbanipal and others for what it symbolically shows. But it shows things here that others don't show, which is why I put this on such a high pedestal. Look at the four-sided pyramid that I mentioned earlier on the show at the top, under the hemispheres, the balance, this law of correspondence concept. There's not two Enlils there. There's one. It's just a symbolic way of showing the left and right side, this balance, law of correspondence concept of balancing the macro and the micro and everything. It's this balance of everything. Now, look at the pyramids at the top. It's what's known as a triptych door that you see later iterations in like Da Vinci's Last Supper and others. It is this concept of Paul, please correct me because you're more of an expert than I am, but in the religious concepts, this would be the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. And when we get into the ancient old religion, this would be more known as like basically the spirit, the body, and the mind. And what it is it's a depiction showing the doorways on how to reach your highest state of power, how to reach your highest state of energy and ascension. So when people ask me, how do I know these ancient people were so sophisticated? I'll go beyond just talking about the pyramids like everybody else does. Look at this box. It's like a gate. It's like basically a mystic's enigmatic box of understanding our reality, the realms of our reality and our role in reality here. Look at the top of the inverted pyramids on the top as well. Notice how the inverted pyramids are only sitting over the Tree of Life. You see that? Just like we see in the mural, this is a blueprint to our reality, guys. If you want to stare at something for the next 10 hours, this is what to stare at. Now, I'm already on top of things before somebody comes out in the comments and says anything. That four-sided pyramid with the inverted pyramid, I'm now tracing and tracking it every single place I can find it in the world. Feel free to leave comments if you want, but I have traced and tracked it to Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, Bolivia, as well as obviously Turkey, Sumer, and a couple of other places. So if anybody else knows of the four-sided pyramid or in the inverted four-sided pyramid anywhere in the world, I am basically putting in their body of research to show that was this teaching school of knowledge that was being passed around, right? And we know it in Christian religion because of the triptych door, and we find it in Machu Picchu and many others. Like, go look at a site like Machu Picchu or the Coricancha in Peru. You'll find this three doorway focused everywhere, and it's the same iteration here, Paul. And it's basically this box, just like the Mirror of Life from Sumer, is telling you about the importance of balance on the earth, the cosmos, harmony, and the gateway and the path, the way showing path for how to reach ascension and how to become like a god of the universe. That's essentially what this is.
There is so much going on this box. Goodness me, we could spend a couple of hours just discussing the symbology here, but I'm fascinated by the connection between the beings above and the beings below, and that in the middle there you've got the triptych door, which you're quite right, echoes in symbology throughout the world. You can find it in Eastern Orthodox churches. When you look at the iconostasis at the front, it's three doorways, one of which will be used by the priests. They also seem to represent ziggurats, which I find intriguing.
Well said, Paul. Thank you. I was going to say that.
This correspondence between what's going on in the heavens and what's going on below is actually represented as a horizontal movement as well, because this notion of connecting with the higher realms and with higher information is right there in the foreground with the offering of the pine cone, which is the representation of the offer of that wisdom at this level to you and me. So it's almost like a story of our relationship with the cosmos, all summarized in the symbols on that box.
Exactly. Thank you, Paul. I could not have said it better. And thank you for bringing that up. Guys, like, think about this for a second. Look at a ziggurat. Now look at those the pyramids up there. It's a temple to ascension. It was the first temple to ascension, and all the other temples mimicked it and changed it slightly. Look at Cambodia. Look at Angkor Wat. Look at Uxmal. Look at Chichen Itza, guys. Don't you see it now? Look at the levels. Chichen Itza doesn't have 4 levels. It has 7, but that's because they just interpreted it a different way, in my opinion. 7 colors of visible light spectrum, 7 chakras. Don't you start to see, guys?
Three layers represents completion, and 7 represents completion as well. So it's a kind of a reiteration of the same statement.
That's right. And so look at here now. Look at the iconic symbology that's shown on the center pyramid, guys, in the boxes. See how it's basically showing you that the ascension is through the center box. Now think about it for a minute. If we have a left and a right hemisphere, guys, imagine your brain right now as quadrants. Imagine that pyramid on the left is your left hemisphere, and imagine that pyramid on the right is your right hemisphere. Imagine the doorway in the center is the gateway. It is the path of ascension and higher knowledge and consciousness. And in order to do that, you must balance the divine masculine and the divine feminine, the left and the right hemispheres of your brain, in order to find that key to open that door in the center, to follow and unlock everything. Every potential we have as creator beings in the cosmos is right there in front of us. But if you don't know what you're looking at, you'll never understand it. That is why it's designed specifically for the initiates and mystics of our ancient past. Now, that very, very long-winded way of showing this as above, so below, law of correspondence, right? The underworld, the above world, the heaven, that's what this is. Now, you look at the role of the Enuma they took up, Enki in the underworld with their Gaul, with Enlil and Thoth and dividing these different realms above and below. Now, the last thing I want to mention, look at the iconography of this. See how it's basically showing you that it is this balance of the above and below, and that the earth realm is this realm in between the realms of reality, okay? That's the type of mentality I want us to see here. Now, the last thing to say, Paul, notice that the tree of life, just as we find in other depictions, is related to the inverted pyramid or the underworld. Think about that for a second, guys. It's not what we think. The path of ascension may be represented through the pyramids, the non-inverted pyramids, but the balance of earth and the harmony of earth and nature and the balance of this sphere we live in is through this energetic underworld energy that was later demonized by the church. It's not what we understand. The more that I've studied, the more I find it to be the most complex understanding of a cycle of incarnation in lives that dictates through destiny or ordaining certain decisions with beings that seem to take up and assume roles in these different aspects of reality to create a game-like simulated world that deals with our morality through our own existence in this incarnation system, in which we learn lessons and we understand new experiences through lifetime after lifetime, only to forget the divinity of who we are and to be thrown back through this. This box represents our way out of this matrix of control and the system that holds us back. It essentially is summing up everything. No wonder this has been a hidden sight, guys. This is why I say that I believe that Atlantis and the ancient Athenians in Egypt and Peru and Bolivia came out of this civilization here. And I'm going to bring you so many more pieces of evidence to show that. But this is the first piece I want to talk about. And I want to break it all down just because I feel like this is so important, guys. It's like we could move on and talk about megaliths, and we are. But don't forget this, because guess what? It was found in Adel Savaz, right below Kef Kalesi and right above these ruins in Lake Vaughan. Now let's keep moving. So here's Kef Kalesi above that city where they found this rock relief. Now imagine a massive civilization all around Lake Vaughan, okay, guys? The Ararat Civilization that had emerged. And it was the first place that we find megalithic building anywhere in the world. Both styles, polygonal and 90-degree angle, sharp designs we're going to find. Now, this is the first site we're going to talk about, Kef Kalesi, above where they found that rock relief. Now, it's right below a massive mountain. You can actually see that mountain above you in the image. It's called Sufandagi. It is like a 13 to 14,000 foot dormant volcano. Seems to be a telltale thing we need to pay attention to, guys. Look at Lake Titicaca. Look at the characteristics of the volcanoes around that lake, and look at the characteristics of the volcanoes around Lake Van, and the depths of the lakes and the ancient ruins. Everything, the similarities are incredible. And there's so many others we're going to find too, like, guys, that inverted pyramid you see it completed in Pumapunku in Bolivia, guys, in Tiwanaku. The exact same image, and I don't have it on me to show in this presentation, but Brian Forrester has shared images of it. If you go look up Pumapunku Brian Forrester, and you're going to find that symbol in Pumapunku across the entire world, showing one of the links between this. So Kef Kalesi, they built these massive basalt blocks that are strewn across this plateau. Imagine an ancient temple shrine dedicated to the gods, which was a place that they connected to them through these priests and great kings, right? Imagine a great temple sitting here below the volcano, overlooking the entire lake. And it's, in my opinion, one of the most important ancient sites in the world, because that rock relief box was found right below this, showing you the importance of this site. I imagine if I were speculating that box came from here, and that box was brought down there for safekeeping long ago and part of an ancient library that was destroyed and then lost to history. And then when they excavated it, and they found it just by accident. But this is Kef Kalesi above the water, above the lake. And guys, look, seriously, look how amazing this is. Look at the precision on these blocks. Some of these blocks are over 1 ton. They're incredible, and nobody knows about it. And it's just part of this unknown civilization that ends up leading all around the world. Now, this is, guys, I know everybody's been waiting for this. I'm sorry it took so long to get to this. But this is a crash course. This is basically like an academic crash course in all of this. This is 2017, Kef Kalesi, underwater, the ruins. So you have above the temple on the mountain, below the volcano, like we see in Delphi, right? Ancient Greece, like in the movie 300. Think about like that. Then you have the ruins that, who knows what the city was where they found that rock relief, probably part of temples or maybe where people lived. That would generally, people would live there, and then the temple would always be up high in a high location, so it makes sense. But we have ruins underwater too, which is kind of amazing. So what it means is that when these ruins were built in Lake Van, the water level was significantly lower than it was. Imagine temple built on the shores. Sort of like that photo in the bottom of the screen with that monastery. Imagine an ancient temple built on the shores of the lake, an ancient temple at the top of the mountain below the volcano, and then sort of like the people and the scholars and the schools probably in between, right? And so this whole site is part of an incredibly complex area, just Kef Kalesi. Not even Zernaki Tepe or Kavis Tepe, just this site. And when they discovered it in 2017, they found it at over 200 feet below water, guys, underwater. That is insane. It's like incredible. And they admitted in the article that when they were trying to understand if it's the Urartu civilization, it didn't make sense that it was less than 6,000 years old, because they determined that in order for the lake to be lower, the lower levels of the lake would have corresponded with the last ice age when it was drier and locked in ice around it more, right? So they determined that would have been at least 15,000 years ago. So I want to make that statement understood, is that these ruins are now have credible archaeological and dating evidence, because they can also date the soil, which I'm sure they're not going to do, the cores, that this site is now the oldest proven site on Earth. That is a very dramatic statement to make. But the best we have right now is Göbekli Tepe with organic carbon dating organic matter at around 11,600 or so for that time period, around the end of the Younger Dryas, which would mean that this is the first we can actually prove with some kind of science that it is at least 15,000 years old. Now look at those blocks, Paul. Look at the scuba diver next to those blocks. Those are precise and incredible blocks that look like something like we see in Peru or in other parts of the world like Egypt. And we're only going to see more evidence of that as we go forward. Okay? Now, This is on the northern end of the site, and this is what first attracted my attention to this location. This is called Zernaki Tepe. And again, excavations just began in 2014. These wonderful photos came from the University of Istanbul, Ankara University, and Bonn University. So thank you very much for allowing me to use them. I want people to look at this for a couple minutes, and maybe if you get a chance and you want to nerd out like you do with this with megaliths like me, look at the top images, especially the top right with that gentleman pointing. Look at the overlap, and essentially, okay, I want to emphasize this. Sorry, guys. Look above his back. Look at where the joints come together on that polygonal block. That is exactly like we see in Machu Picchu and throughout Peru, guys. It is evidence of the first corresponding megaliths in the world that mimic an entire other part of the world, thousands of miles away. And I believe that this is the first emergence, and this is a very bold statement, but I believe this is the first emergence of megalithic, highly precise megalithic polygonal building at Zernaki Tepe. And we're going to see other iterations of it, a place called Ebla as we go, that I believe then was mastered at Machu Picchu with even larger stones and Saskatchewan to be a perfected iteration of this civilization. Okay? Now, I haven't even told you how that connects to the Sumerian kings in a second. We're going to get that in the Noah bloodlines. But I'm showing you, I want you to be baffled by the incredible nature and sophistication of these sites, because then I'm going to show you how it links it all together. Now, that mountain on the bottom of the screen, those squares, that entire mountain represents this Zernaki Tepe civilization that is one of the largest we know of in this entire part of the world. It's one of the largest ancient sites on Earth, guys. And I say that because when they started excavating it, and they're only about 1% done right here in the photos, they did aerial shots of this mountain that sits over Lake Van. It's a very cool, very prominent mountain, similar to Kef Kalesi though, but a little further away, that sits up and commands over the entire area. And that's a theme we'll see with Kavis Tepe as well. And this location, what they found is when they did aerial photography over the top, they found that the entire mountain is a civilization, like the entire mountain. And so they've only just begun here, but look at what we're seeing, guys. This is not residential neighborhoods. These are temples. You would not go to this level of sophistication without creating incredible temples. These are temples. Who knows what we're going to find? And they've also found king's lists here as well. King's lists that we have yet to see, but they mentioned in articles. And look at the joints on those stones, guys. We find that in Egypt at Abu Ruwash and Abu Sir and throughout the Giza Plateau, and in Peru we see these joints where they were using tools and different things to move and create these, and we've never found tools to ever match them. So that's Zernaki Tepe. Now, guys, this is just mind-blowing for someone who, like me, that's a geology, ancient history nerd. This site I just accidentally discovered during this excavations of this area looking, because it was shared online. Whoever shared it, I want to, I guess, say thank you, but they shared it as being in Peru. And it was shown as being the finest example of megalithic architecture in the world. And they had credited it as being in Cusco, Peru. Now, it isn't in Peru. It's a long ways from Peru. It's on the other side of the world. It is Kavis Tepe, Turkey. I'll go back really quick, guys. I know, just in case you forgot. Here's Kavis Tepe here on the southeast side of Lake Van. And it's on, what it is it's built on this massive pointy mountain that looked over a very, very fertile valley there where a river used to flow into Lake Van and no longer does. So it shows you that this whole area has gone through great transformations over time. So here we have Kavis Tepe. These are basalt blocks, very similar to Kef Kalesi, different to Zernaki Tepe, guys, right? The emergence of two styles of megaliths. 90-degree angle, precise, sharp cuts, like we see in Egypt and in Pumapuku and Tiwanaku. Important to remember, don't forget that. And the Zernaki Tepe with polygonal stones, like we see in Machu Picchu and Saskatchewan. So in this location, if you just somebody wants to do a quick search to blow their mind, go just do a search for Kavis Tepe and go look up Japheth and look up King Hake, right? King Hake is, like I mentioned earlier in the show, was the ruler of this region. Okay, he's supposed to be this bloodline descendant of Japheth. Now, whoever, for you, Paul, who knows bloodlines and already knows this, Japheth is a descendant son, a descendant directly of the Sumerian kings of Sumer. In fact, it's one of 3 sons of Noah. That's what's so fascinating and baffling about this, because the Atrahasis, the Epic of Gilgamesh, they talk about how Shuruppak was this ancient city that this king survived this catastrophe, right? And that he had 3 sons, and that biblically we're told that those 3 sons went off and created the new world. They show that we have maps we're going to show in a second. Now, what about the proof, though? Well, look what we have here is that this site was ruled by King Hake, who is a 3rd or 4th generation, even on Wikipedia, 3rd or 4th generation descendant of Japheth himself, proving that the story in the Atrahasis was true, that Noah landed on Mount Ararat and that his 3 sons had an agreement with Enlil and Enki to then branch out. This is the theory that I'm going to try to attempt to prove here, guys. The 3 families would then branch out and create the new world, but some of the sons would be under Enlil and some would be under Enki, which is why the ancient Athenians were ruled by Zeus. Atlantis is like the perfection of Enki's civilization, and the Athenians are the perfection of Zeus's civilization, Enlil's civilization. And we see that agreement must have been made on Mount Ararat, because these 3 sons then go off and their descendants create all of these civilizations everywhere in the world. And this megalithic style and the knowledge that's emerges here that came from Sumer then travels all around the world, and we find that. And we find the same bloodlines, and guys, we're going to find DNA comparisons that match, and we're going to find, again, those biblical connections that are exactly the same thing, in elongated skulls and the same megalithic designs as we go along here. So Kavas Tepe, why is there primitive stuff on the bottom? Like Kef Kalesi, the Urartu civilization who built that limestone on top tried to mimic them. They could not mimic them other than getting the blocks to fit in. They've tried to rebuild. What we're going to come to now is what I consider the most important site of the 4 of this lost Ararat civilization of Eastern Turkey. And I wanted to tell the story of it a little bit and just bring this one a little bit more attention, because honestly, guys, this may be one of the most important archaeological sites ever found in terms of the iconography with the symbols and the giant stone masonry and how we find the rise of megaliths, the shared symbols with Sumer and other places around the world. The andesite, that's the type of stone called andesite. It's like a type of granite, very hard, a 7 on a Mohs hardness scale that was found in this site and others. And we're going to go over it, but it truly is an archaeological wonder. This is a place that is so grand that part of why I want to bring this up and discuss it is that it has been one of these sites that's kept quite hidden for a little while now, at least 5 years. This site has remained under the radar and kept tight-lipped by those within the Turkish archaeological community. And I want to call out the fact that I understand the significance of this site, but the fact that nobody in our community, or really anyone in the alternative history, and I hate that term, but those who are trying to change this narrative and look at evidence objectively, I don't know anybody who knows of this site. This site is called Ayanis Kalesi. And the first thing is Kalesi means castle, and it's clearly not a castle. So I'm going to keep referring it to that, but really what it needs to be called is Ayanis Temple. And that's really what this is. Now, I only became aware of this because I was studying a dissertation from the University of Chicago from, I think it was I believe it was a Turkish individual who was studying there at the University of Chicago. And he was writing about Kef Kalesi and how the giant stones were of some of the finest quality in the world. But he had said in it that there was a site that was being excavated and it was of great value and importance to the Turkish archaeological community that had even finer stonework and even more incredible sophistication. And I have a bunch of quotes from the article about how even in the mind of the Urartu that mind doctrine of civilization being less than 6,000 years old, this archaeologist comes out and claims and makes these incredible statements about how the structures here, the megaliths, the intricate designs, the stonework, the sophistication and innovation is unlike anything in the region that seems to emerge out of nowhere. And he goes on to describe how it almost rewrites history as we know it, with the type of masonry and the type of sophistication that comes out of this. And I was baffled reading that. Just this very, very hidden paper that was, part of this archaeological dissertation for Turkey. And when I went to this site and started to see what they were uncovering, I had what I want to coin a George Smith moment. And for anyone who understands and studies this in the way that I do, this is dear to my heart. Uncovering something that's a mystery, uncovering something that connects to something much greater, that is like a missing link between everything, is a profound moment. And I had that with Ayanis Kalesi. When I saw this site and started seeing the symbols and seeing the site for what it is and its connections everywhere, that George Smith moment I literally like ran around the room several times, which is exactly what George Smith did. Not to compare, but with the grandeur of his work, but that's what he did when he cracked the Sumerian code for the first time with the Epic of Gilgamesh. And so it was a profound moment. I just want to say my excitement is almost the highest it can for this site. So that'll tell you the degree of why I'm trying to express this story. Now, this site is so important, and this region is so important to everything around the world. And because the archaeological community out of Turkey is covering this up and hiding it, and I found out this through the actual someone in the Turkish archaeological community, as well as several other connections I became aware of, that similar to Egypt with Zahi Hawass, is that the archaeological community in Turkey, the sort of the top level academics that are in charge with excavations from three sites, or three places: Istanbul University, Lake Van University, and Ankara University, as well as the actual Turkish archaeological government establishment. They are uncovering these sites and they're not telling anybody. And they're quietly doing this, and I'll show you in a second. And it's being hush-hush like Egypt is, because the sites here that are being discovered are going to change the world. Now, officially, the archaeologists that are working on the site are all under the belief, and it's been well established in papers from the site with the excavations are occurring, that they believe it's part of the Urartu civilization that we've talked about many, many times. And I have it on the screen on the bottom here to show that. Now, obviously, I am not here uncovering this right now to take credit for in any means for this location, but I will want to step out and put myself out there to say that, look, I want to be the first one to connect this with the lost Ararat civilization of Lake Van, this ancient lost megalithic civilization that far predated the Urartu civilization, connected to the biblical version of Noah and the Sumerian king Utanapishtim. I want to be the one that connects that story. And so for me, this has become so big and so significant that I have changed the entire focus of the new book after the one with Billy Carson releases soon in the next month. The book after that I'm writing, my fourth book, is going to now be focused on Lake Van and all the connections with Sumer, Peru, throughout Bolivia, Mexico, specifically Bolivia, guys, with Tiwanaku and Pumapunku, as well as places like, in Lebanon and China and a lot of other places in the world, Egypt, Atlantis, of course, all these things. This is going to be the body of this, and I want to be remembered for this as my greatest accomplishment, I hope, is connecting this mysterious lost story with all the megaliths and all the lost civilizations, which I believe derives back to this location. And of all of that, I believe that this site, Ayanis Kalesi, may be the most important of them all. Similar to Kef Kalesi, which is on the opposite side of the lake, this site was an incredible temple site that looked over the lake and actually looked what seems like I gotta have someone look at can someone who's a nerd like me, please look at the alignments of Ayanis Kalesi and Kef Kalesi if possible. See if they align across the lake. I'd be very curious. I haven't got to that level yet, but I think they're closely connected. And discovered only in 1989, and it's only been excavated over the last 5 to 10 years. This site is going to change our entire understanding of the world, guys. It is, to me, something that gets me excited looking at this, and this is what keeps me up. And I want to show you more images of this. Comes directly out of the excavation sites, and I want to show more. But on the screen, you can clearly see the Urartu civilization in yellow with the mimicking of the work, but very primitive sandstone. Always a type of sandstone, limestone, very soft work, with the andesite and basalt on the lower levels of this incredible temple, which I am becoming quickly the believer in terms of my understanding that this may be one of the most important temple archaeological sites in the whole world, guys. And let's look closer. So you can see why I'm so excited. Look at this for a minute. Not only do you have the cross, some of the first cross, the imagery we see on Earth, besides Sumer, but there it is again in the center of the screen is the cross being like the totality of everything. And what you find is that quickly, if you compare Kef Kalesi with the giant relief that I talked a lot about in this show, you're going to see that the same importance is here with the same symbolism. Like we find the cross with the sun symbol, as well as with the symbol of basically the Anuna gods here. Okay. And that's what's so incredible, is that it's all here. Okay. And it all traces back to the roots of what everything became later on. Now look at this altar site. This is dedicated to the god Haldi, like we know, who is the same god that's on the rock relief we talked about, who I believe is Enlil from Sumer, but a different iteration of Enlil at a time when it was decided to make a golden age. So knowledge was being handed down, and this was like a mystery school, ancient temple of the highest degree. Now, look at the zoomed in winged figure of Haldi in the depictions, because I'm going to do a comparison in a second, as well as notice the andesite. And look at the quality of this, guys. It is like unmatched. It is breathtaking. Remember, again, basalt and andesite. Basalt is a 6 on the hardness scale, but andesite is a 7. It's as hard as, it's similar to granite, but it's just incredible to think that the site could be well over 20,000 years old and recordably the oldest site on Earth right now. Now, here's a comparison I wanted you guys to see. Here again, I firmly believe that these temples are going to be proven to be linked across the lake from either side. So there's a connection here that needs to firmly be explored, and it's one of the things that's going to be a big part of the new book. And the new book title now is going to be The Missing Link of History, The Lost Ararat Civilization, and it's going to connect this everywhere in the world and truly get to the mysteries and the knowledge of all of this, because it's incredible. Now, look at the comparisons here, guys. So there's Haldi on both of these, both from the two temple sites. Incredible work here. Now, notice the similarities in the gods with the wings and the type of passing of knowledge or passing along something. Now, watch this. I didn't get a chance to compare this before, but I am now. This is from the Ashurbanipal library, of course. I believe this is far older than we're told and comes from the ancient Sumerians, and the king Ashurbanipal, he just simply put this in the library, okay? But what this is one of the most incredible reliefs ever found, and it depicts the tree of life, just like this, guys. Look, but the tree of life in this case is actually a different tree, but it's supposed to be the tree of life, but the version from the Turkey region, which had different trees, and then this is from Mesopotamia, so it's like a willow or something similar. It's a symbol. But notice the wings and notice the similarities with Enlil, who I believe that one of the god who's on one of the sides of this image of a priest and a king being handed rulership over the ancient world is the same image, the same god we're seeing depicted here. Okay, but from a later iteration, another time, which is why it looks a little bit different. But it's closely connected back to the same place. And that's what's so incredible about this. It really is, guys. It is the missing link of history. And I can't wait to explore this further and try to change history with this. And that's what I truly hope to achieve in this work. Now, lastly, part of the same site, Ayanis Kalesi, you can see the temple in the background. but also look at the work in the front, I guess you would call it. Just amazing. This is done with basalt and a combination of andesite. But I did a comparison for everybody who it's difficult to see the differences between the civilizations, so you to believe the work and the difference. So I wanted to make this in terms of being hopefully helpful for people. But clearly you can see that the Urartu civilization found this incredible temple and then tried to build and fix it after the destruction. And their work largely didn't survive except for pieces of it, because sandstone and limestone is very soft. It's not going to survive that. It's not going to do well over thousands and thousands of years, because even their work is at a minimum of 2,000 to 3,000 years old. And that's what's so incredible, is that theirs barely made it. Some of the highest level of work they did here did. But look at the bottom work. That bottom work is over 20,000 years old, but with an incredibly hard stones, and it lasted the test of time. Now, for those who are going to ask, and undoubtedly in the comments, what does this say? We don't fully know the entire breakdown of it, but I know some of it, and what it largely encompasses, both here and Cavus Tepe and others, is this is what's so incredible, guys. Remember that paper I told you, the dissertation from University of Chicago that mentioned the sophistication here? These writings talk about creating something like never created before, temples of grandeur to emerge, right? This is, guys, this is the emergence of what's known as the golden age of civilization and humanity, that then spread everywhere to create Atlantis and create the Athenians and create the Egyptians after the Kemet, the land of Kem, and the Peruvians and the Bolivians. Those regions of the world and other places as well came from here. It was like an ancient mystery school, ancient temples that was when relowering of a whole different kind of knowledge was handed down here. And so there's so much to come out of here yet. But I wanted to end on the last slide for Ayanis to show you the outside of it, because if anybody doesn't think what I said before about this being important or about being a hush-hush in the story, look at this. First of all, this is the entrance to the temple. These basalt columns you see in front of you are multi-ton and massive and just incredible. Imagine a temple of such grandeur. Imagine you walk in and you have these basalt columns that are 20, 30, maybe higher, 40 feet high, these enormous columns, and you walk through this temple, and among it is another aspect of the temple that emerges within it. It's like an andesite enclosed central part of the temple looking over the lake, with this basically an altar in the center with the highest level of grandeur of any civilization in the world at this time, I believe. And they're studying it right now. And this structure, for anybody who's looked at Göbekli Tepe, first of all, I think this is far more sophisticated than that. But I want to compare the enclosure that's been created here. Notice they only do that for certain sites. For whoever's paying attention to this, in terms of the details, there are 4 sites I've discovered around Lake Vaughan that all connect to this civilization. 2 are being excavated. 2 are just sitting there that are not even being touched. Zerneki Tepe is being excavated, but it doesn't have any kind of an overhang. It doesn't have an enclosure. This is the only one that's putting this kind of detail and effort into it. So there are important people headed here right now. The word is getting out. This is the site that's going to change everything. So, guys, yes. I have laid out what I consider the Ararat civilization, a previously unknown civilization that I believe connects all around the world, with these rock reliefs, these similar symbols, with the same megalithic designs, with now let's add the layer that Paul is an absolute expert on. Let's add the layer of the ancient Hebrew understanding of these bloodlines of Noah. Now, what they state, and this is why it's so fascinating, guys, what they state is that Japheth was in charge of Europe. It's like his domain, okay? Europe, think about Europe as in Asia Minor, like Turkey, westward through the Mediterranean and through the ancient Athenians in Greece that we're going to show and talk about in a second. For those who don't know, around Athens, there are some of the finest and largest megaliths in the world are found in that region on the bottommost levels. Richard Casaro has shared that images of those, and others have shared them as well. There's the ancient Athenians, ancient pre-Greeks was a civilization that came out of this. out of Japheth and the Enlil influence, which became Zeus. And they perfected and created what Plato then described in the Timaeus and Critias as the most perfect civilization was ever created on Earth. That's what they state. And at first you want to think that it's maybe Greek pride, but the more that you actually learn about this civilization, you find that maybe it was perfect in the best sense that it can be, which is why Plato compared it to Atlantis, because Atlantis became a corrupted empire, which are great lessons for now. And so, and Paul, please jump in at any point. But look at this chart for a second. It's starting to match what we're seeing, which means that if the story is true from Sumer, then the sons of Noah were some of the most major influences. I won't say the only influences, but some of the most major influences that then created all of these what's called highly advanced super civilizations around the world, which I think Bolivia with Pumapunku and Machu Picchu and Saskatchewan and parts of the Maya area, parts of Turkey, obviously, Egypt, Atlantis and the Athenians, and parts of China were part of this lost chapter of these super civilizations that may have had their roots that started here. And I want to add one more thing. I brought up the idea that megaliths just emerged out of nowhere and they didn't exist beforehand. I think this next iteration of civilizations that came out of Noah that then built all these megaliths around the world and the great civilizations that came out of them, I believe that they may have been handed tools and technologies that they did not have before, which is why I think this emergence of sophistication just becomes that much greater after that point. And I think that's an important thing to understand here, because it's a confusing timeline going up and down, but generally losing knowledge over time, generally, as we go along. But these bloodline names seem to be matching up with what we're finding. And so it's starting to make a lot more sense that, and I just want to just mention one more thing, Paul, before you jump in, is that look at the story of Atlantis from Thoth, from the Emerald Tablets for a second. Look at it from Edward Casey. Look at it from Diodorus. Look at it from all those places. If Atlantis was founded 50,000 years ago, after this, and I have other sites I'm going to show you to link that in a second, guys. This isn't it. But if that's true, then if Zep Tepi is 38,000 years ago, and if Thoth is right, and that Zep Tepi came out of the priests and sages of Atlantis before it was destroyed, and then they created Egypt, Kem, then it makes sense that Atlantis is 50,000 years ago, Egypt 38,000 years ago, and that this region is at least 50. And I think that's how I'm laying it out to try to put this in a context so we can understand. Here's an interesting place, guys, to connect how I'm giving some proof to show you, everyone that's listening, that Sumer in that region of Iraq has had multiple civilizations come and go and rise and fall. What you're seeing here on the left side of the screen is not the original Sumerians, okay? What you're seeing on the right side of the screen are not the original Sumerians either. You're seeing the emergence out of Kish and the emergence of higher technologies and megaliths that we even see in Iraq. I don't know if anyone is aware that there are any megaliths in Iraq, but there are, guys. This is in northern Iraq in an area called Jirwan, not as young as they're telling us it is. And I believe it's evidence to show that there's another iteration of Sumer and of this region that became more sophisticated. And the emergence of megaliths first started. Now, that's a real image on the left. That is a real archaeologist. Look at the size of those blocks. That's the largest cuneiform in the world. It's like written from giants, right? Book of Enoch, like giants. And those seem to emerge out of nowhere, like Kish emerges after the New World and builds again. And so the same knowledge and technological means seems to have also been handed down to Kish, to Etana, who then created this as an iteration, then moved westward and eastward. There seems to be like a new civilization emerging, and there's bits and pieces of it we can see. Now look at the image on the right. Paul, notice that giant black stripe that goes down the left side and somewhere on the right side. That is vitrification of that rock, melting. That temperatures to do that would have had to exceed 1,000 to 2,000 degrees to create that. It means that this was created before a massive catastrophe came through. Now, those I highlighted them because they've been bombed down and shot by ISIS and other armies. But before they blew all this stuff up, those holes weren't there. These are the most massive rock reliefs of the Anuna on Earth. Did you know that, Paul? These are the largest rock relief sculptures of the Anuna on the Earth, on the planet. These rock reliefs are hundreds and hundreds of feet tall. And it's very unknown, actually. It's very few people know about it. But this is called Kinis Rock, okay? It's called Khinis, called Kinis Rock, and that is King Sennacherib, which is one of the ancient Sumerian kings that came after Etana to rebuild the ancient world. And Enlil and Ninlil are handing him kingship to create the new world after Etana. And that shows you that there was a whole different influence in different time period when these great Sumerian kings were basically like creating entire cities and civilizations around the world. And those megalithic blocks in Iraq are proof of a more sophistication that came out of Sumer at another iteration. Look how big they are. We don't see that anywhere in Sumer. That's just showing you that the influences of Kish and of the sons of Noah are traveling. They're creating civilizations as they go. They're moving around the world, guys. Okay? Now, here's a site very few people ever talk about, Paul. It's like almost unknown. And one of the reasons is it's not there anymore. One of the saddest sites in the world, guys. Just Ain Dara, destroyed by Syria in 2018 by accident, in quotes, during their bombing. The story is that lion on the right side is a solid basalt lion. That site is all basalt. Basalt, again, remember Kef Kalesi, guys? This is where I want your mind to go back to. Kavis Tepe and Kef Kalesi were built entirely out of basalt. It was their energetic type of stone. It's a volcanic stone they loved. It was part of the Japheth civilization. It was their telltale signature. They built out of basalt and then granite once they got to Greece because they didn't have any basalt there. But this lion was underneath the ground, completely submerged and lost to history. And someone was walking through here in, I think it was 1940s or 50s. Double check me on that date. But they saw the head sticking up out of the ground. Now, for those who want to know the size of that lion would be like the size of several people in terms of height. It's enormous. Multi tons. Intricately carved basalt lion. Now, how would you do that, guys? If it was a Bronze Age civilization like we're taught, Bronze Age tools would be impossible to carve anything like that of basalt, because basalt falls under a 6 to 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, and granite falls under 7, 8 on the hardness scale, which means they're extremely hard to carve, guys. I had a stonemason engineer contact me the other day that's telling me that they have a quarry that they are constantly working with granite and different materials and limestone and different things. And several quarries, and one of the quarries has basalt, and he says they're constantly the machines like these massive excavators are the teeth on the machine that grinds up stone is constantly getting damaged and sometimes destroyed by when they run into basalt when they're trying to get into other materials. This stuff is so hard, guys. And to create entire temples with this kind of intricacy is just amazing. Now, Paul, look at the symbolism on what is basically a lion slash depiction of like Ishtar, who is the goddess of this temple with the lion. Remember this, guys? Let's go way back. We got it for just a second. We have to look at the symbology here, guys. For a second, look the lions. Look at the curves in his clothes on Kaldi or Haldi. Look at those symbols. Now watch this. Go back. It's the same thing, guys. Look at the curves. Look at the designs. Look at the wings. Look at the lions. It's the same thing. This was another city created by Japheth. Now it's created in honor of Ishtar. Ishtar was a goddess who was aligned with Enlil, who was a god of war and fertility, and was one of the ancient, strongest influences we see that then gave the rise of the ancient Athenians and Greek culture. So you find the influences of Ishtar and Zeus, the strongest two influences in ancient Greece, and the strongest two influences here. basically that shows you the connections back to Lake Vaughan. Now that footprint, that's real, guys. That is a 10 to 12 inch long or larger. I think it's actually well over a foot. Footprint that's supposed to be symbolic of the gods, Ishtar's, walking among them in the temple. It's supposed to be symbolic of them, the giants, these great gods walking among them. So here's a connection. They're moving westward. So guys, we're tracking it. Kavis Tepe, Kef Kalesi, Japheth creates those civilization, the Ararat Civilization. They move west, southwest. Here they are in Syria. They create Andara. Where do they go next? They don't go to Ebla, but the family and the influences of Zernaki Tepe does. You guys see that? Look at the materials. Look at the stone. Let me go back. See? Now we see the influences of this branch. I mean, it may not have been Japheth. It may have been another one of those families that was moving to another region. You know, Shem or Ham that did this. That's my theory on it. Because then Ebla, we find their style here. See the primitive stuff on top, Paul. Now look at the highly advanced stuff, megaliths down below it and on the left side. Now look at the corner of that stone on the left side of the screen with the same type of block, polygonal blocks. Guys, they're traveling southwest to the Mediterranean. Guess where the Mediterranean leads? The Atlantic. Then you get to Bolivia and you get to Peru. It's right here. It's their progression. It's the progression of going. Now, Ebla is an amazing place, Paul. Ebla contains the second largest cuneiform library in the world. Outside of the Ashurbanipal library, and it was over 12,000 cuneiform tablets were found here. And this library is unique in a way that no other library on the earth is. I actually believe that the Ashurbanipal library and the Ebla Royal Library are the two most important libraries on earth. Ebla contains cuneiform and ancient tablets and king's lists, right, that connect to Sumer, the reigns, that's not only in Sumerian, but in Akkadian, Babylonian, ancient Armenian, okay?
Whoa.
And we find writings from Malta in the Mediterranean and ancient Egypt, guys. It's all here. This Ebla is the crossroads of the ancient world. If anybody wants to know where it is, it's Ebla. It's because of its proximity to the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and the Persian Gulf. Imagine these civilizations crossing through here, all of them. And so it's a library that's the encompassment of all the civilizations sharing knowledge. That's what I want people to wrap their heads around. That's why there's so many things shared all over the place with Peru and Bolivia, with Mexico, with Turkey, with Greece, with Egypt, with Sumer, with China, guys, with Cambodia. It's all being shared around the world by these traveling civilizations. So Ebla then connects us to the Mediterranean. And here's actual images of the Royal Library when they discovered it. These are real images of the Royal Library at Ebla with all of these ancient tablets that connect all around the world. They were talking about how these incredible people were traveling around and basically using maritime travel to go all over the planet. Now, I got to go quickly. I know this is going on kind of long, guys. But here's a quick map just to show you. There's a circle of that region that everything emerged and then used the Mediterranean, in my opinion, and the Persian Gulf, because I don't want to forget India, guys. I don't want to forget the incredible giant cave reliefs we find in Saudi Arabia, we find in Iran, we find in India. Those are obviously part of these iterations because remember, that same symbol, the inverted pyramid, and those designs we see, we find at Lake Vaughan. So it has to be some kind of emergence of three different, and I want to reiterate this for megalithic nerds, guys, three different forms of building only in the world that came out of this. We see the polygonal megaliths, like Peru. We saw the 90-degree, very, very precise angled stones that are non-polygonal, like in Egypt, that we see at Kavis Tepe. And then we see a third. We see another branch of these families decided to create, instead of creating temples that are above ground or made of actual blocks, they create these giant rock relief temples into the earth and into the ground that were just different. But they were highly sophisticated in how they carved them. And that's what you can see is that those three designs then traveled all around the world and were part of the lost civilization chapters. And these ancient biblical bloodline maps, they seem to emphasize that extremely well, guys. It's like it's being now proved by the megaliths. Very quickly, here's Ebla. Look at the influences of the Ebla civilization on this map in Sumer. There's the land of Canaan, guys. Book of Enoch, sons of Enoch, the whole story. Look, it's all there. It's descendants of Sumer. They came out. They connected around the world. And let's go all the way on this side of the world, right? Brian Forster and Lloyd Pye and others, they do genetic tests of these incredible non-cranial enlargement Paracas skulls that came out of Peru near these sites, and they genetically test exactly back to the Armenian Lake Von area with the Caucasus region area of the world. Genetic testing 100% connects them back to here, as well as the elongated skulls from the Hypogeum in the Oracle Chamber of Malta in the Mediterranean. The elongated skulls there also genetically tested back, Paul, to this exact region, showing you that the influences archaeologically, through biblical bloodlines and genetics, is matching now all around the world.
So just pausing on the question of bloodlines and elongated skulls, how do they fit into the picture? Because it's not an alteration that's been done artificially by mums wanting to make their babies look like someone else. This is information about the wider human family that emerges from the elongated skulls. How do they fit into this story of repopulation and the bloodlines of Noah?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. When we look at things like skulls like of Akhenaten, and we look at the elongated skulls of Peru and how they were all put in a special burial. We look at the elongated skulls of Malta, put in a special burial, like they knew that they were ancient, important people that were no longer around anymore. I think that's the entire purpose why we see cranial enlargement throughout the world of cultures trying to mimic it. What I believe it is a genetic legacy that has been largely lost that ties back into some of these Sumerian bloodlines, as well as the Egyptian bloodlines. There seemed to have been a branch of these giant gods that had elongated skulls. And some of these families, they tended not, it tends to show in the evidence that they didn't have the same characteristics, but others did. I think that's an area that we're going to need to really study in the future and try to understand. It's still a tiny bit unknown because we have to truly understand the genetics to figure it out. But it seems to be a legacy that was part of these lost civilizations and these wise sages traveling around, that it was then honored by the later civilizations and mimicked. Like, they knew that what they were from long ago.
Yes, that's right. So it's a global contact, a global memory, and then a global pattern of commemorating and copying.
Oh, exactly. And thank you, Paul. This is one more thing to throw on there, guys. On the right, that's from the Olmec civilization. It's one of my favorite rock relief statues in the world. That is an Olmec with Kukulkan, basically the god Kukulkan behind him, the snake god Enki, Thoth Enki, connected behind him, with him having the handbasket passing knowledge to create the civilizations in Mesoamerica. It's the same thing we see iterations around the world. And in 1958, a farmer plowing his field found a ancient that was confirmed, an ancient vase, ceremonial vase that had cuneiform written in it. In Bolivia, guys, near Tiwanaku, that has the very same influences and symbology as Lake Von and ancient Sumer. It does, and the same megalithic architecture. The connections are becoming almost too much, guys. Just going to end out here by saying we find evidence around the world of catastrophes beyond our comprehension, guys, on magnitudes that were enough to wipe out entire chapters of our story. We need to honor them and learn from them and make sure that the same thing doesn't happen to us as well, so that we don't become just simply a memory like the past.
What you shared with us today is is controversial. It gives lots of people lots of problems. On the one hand, there'll be archaeologists struggling to catch up with this new information because it really trespasses into timelines that have been, shall we say, extracurricular for a very long time. People who are interested in biblical narratives will be scratching their heads as well, because I think when we come at it from a biblical start point, we tend to read the Bible sequentially and miss the fact that we've got a number of stories of beginnings side by side. And by the time you get to Genesis 11, there have been, by my counting, at least 5 planetary cataclysms. And in Genesis 11, we've got this reference to people saying, let's build differently. Because there's clearly a cultural memory of cataclysms and of society being wiped out, the architecture being wiped out. So they're going to build differently this time. And in the Bible, that's when they get into building with brick. So we're only halfway through the story that you shared with us at that point. But I think once we can recognize this is a sequence of stories of beginnings, for those who have biblical issues around this, and then once we realize there is this timeline that has been nothing more than extracurricular in the world of ancient archaeology, we can begin to think through all the implications that you shared with us today. And I find it really intriguing that there is such resistance to the archaeology that you are referencing today, Matthew, because there is a very broad consensus in the scientific community that we can trace the story of Homo sapiens back 200,000 years. So that's before the Younger Dryas, that's before the Older Dryas, that's before a number of cataclysms. It's a very long timeline. That's acknowledged. So what's the problem with saying a civilization before the Younger Dryas? What's the problem with saying an advanced civilization? What's the problem with saying a global civilization? I wonder if you could just say in sort of summary form why you think there's such resistance to doing business with the information that you shared with us today.
Yeah, that's well said, Paul. We're at a point where it's a massive paradigm shift that's about to occur in our reality. What this information has been known by very, very many powerful people, elites, those who are in charge of this narrative for a very, very long time. We don't know how long. Could be hundreds of years, could be thousands of years. This has been carried down with this knowing, but there was obviously a decision made to hide this information. It was a combination of many, many different things that I believe is traced back into the emergence of the Holy Roman Empire from the Roman empires, where I think the majority of this was traced to, where it was an attempt to control history and the narrative in a way that it's never been before. And that has continued on to where we are now. And the reason for that is, as we talked about earlier in the show, this is not about just saying, look, there's an entire different timeline and epics of our civilization that have come and gone, and look, aren't they interesting because they built cool rocks. It's not about that. It's about the knowing that they left behind with the understanding that they had of our realm, of our reality, our earth, our existence here, our purpose in the universe. Like I find it rather interesting that so many of these questions that so many people think are unanswered are somewhat answered and rather explained by the ancients. If you know how to understand what they're trying to say, if you know how to look at the things they left behind, the ancient texts, the murals like we showed, just literally depicting, look, guys, we're going to leave behind the keys to ascension and becoming gods of the universe if you want to. But it's left behind in these places. And the powers that be and the elites that are in charge of our world today, the darker parts of our humanity that's still here, they have held this back for a long time. They don't want this to exist, but it's coming out piece by piece, and the old narrative is crumbling. It is truly, like Graham Hancock says, history is built on a foundation of sand. And that foundation of sand is collapsing all around us. And a new narrative is emerging, a narrative that empowers us and takes us away from purely Darwinism into a place of realizing the divinity of us and our place within the universe and the stars, to bring us back home. And instead of only looking forward, we remember where we came from, so that when we do go forward, we can go forward and reach that next chapter of Aquarius and take those first steps into the golden age.
I love how you are shining a light on all these ancient sites. So much has been not studied, so much has been destroyed or been allowed to be looted. But you've shone a light on a number of very important sites, the study of which is going to change our understanding of the planet's history, humanity's history, who we are and where we might be going. I really want to applaud your courage in going onto this territory, because the information you're revealing is so important. Where can people go to keep up with your research in this field? I know you've got a new series coming on Gaia, and you've got this one. I love the title of your new book, The Epic of Humanity. Is this information in that book, or are we waiting for another publication?
Thanks, Paul. So for people that want to look into my work, go to my website if you're interested at thestageoftime.com. I have a YouTube channel, and there's a lot going on with this moving forward, guys. The first thing I want to just mention that you brought up, there's a lot of this work we discussed in this presentation is going to be in the Epic of Humanity. A lot of amazing quotes and a lot of evidence to really recreate the story of us with timelines and to tell our incredible epic and the epics that have come before us. So that book that I wrote with Billy Carson called The Epic of Humanity, we had a couple delays with editing, but we're done, and it should be September that it's coming out. So look forward to that. And a lot of this new research that is just emerging out of Eastern Turkey is going to be part of some of the new book that I'm writing right now that is going to be dealing with this lost connection between Sumer and Atlantis. So there's a lot going on my plate, as well as you mentioned ancient civilizations doing a lot with some of this work, and even some other avenues, potentially some other people have reached out wanting to do docu-series and mini-series and get to Eastern Turkey and really do a lot of work with this. So the future is exciting with this, guys. And all I really want to do is change the narrative and change history. And I truly believe that the Ararat Civilization in Lake Vaughan is the missing link between the lost civilizations of Earth and our true past and our history.
I love that, Matt. All I want to do is change history. And you've got a series on Gaia that we should know about.
Well, I was pretty integral in working on Ancient Civ Season 5 that we're working on releasing very, very soon. That's going to have a lot of very, very cool cutting-edge stuff with the Athenians and Atlanteans and others. So stay tuned for that coming out, and quite a bit more that I can't talk about. But
Superb. Well, Matt, we really appreciate you sharing this information on the Fifth Kind TV today. It's always a pleasure to have a virtual conversation with you. And I'm looking forward to seeing you next month in Boulder, as it happens, which will be a first and an exciting experience. But for today, thank you so much for joining us. I am so impressed with the information you shared. I will be sitting down and watching this a second time and taking notes as I go. I will look forward very much to you returning at some point and having another conversation with us.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you, Fifth Kind. I appreciate you guys so much. And until our next conversation.
Thanks, Matt.